Hi everyone, welcome back to another video from my office because the weather has not been the best the last few days, so I'm hunkering down with some coffee and I'm gonna address a video topic that I had quite a few requests for. So about a month ago now, I did a Lightroom editing video, which was basically showing you guys how to treat your raw files to get them to a place where you can get the most versatility out of them. And I think that video went down quite well, and I had a ton of comments from people asking me to do a more in-depth Lightroom editing tutorial, but talking more about color and sort of stylizing photos. So that's what we're gonna do today. I've got a few photos lined up that I'm gonna show you guys how I treated them, and hopefully this is gonna give you guys some tips and some things to think about when approaching your own photo edits. So grab yourself a caffeinated beverage of your choice, and let's dive into Lightroom. So my approach when it comes to photo editing is not necessarily the most complicated, because I feel like my editing style is not particularly drastic in terms of completely revisualizing what I see in the field when taking photos. I still want to retain the essence of the scene in terms of how it looks to the naked eye, but I do want to try and create a little bit of cohesion throughout my portfolio and throughout the images that I take. It's something that is important to me. It doesn't have to be important to you, but there's definitely things that I like to do. There are certain, I guess, preferences I have when it comes to color and how I treat colors and how that color, I guess, impacts like the contrast as well within a particular image. So let's start with this photo here. I'm going to quickly deal with the exposure and contrast. If you want to know more about why I make these choices, then go and watch the previous video that I did, which I referenced in the intro. I'll link it down in the description, but that talks a bit more about how I approach contrast in my images. But just quickly, what I like to do is deal with the exposure first of all, so I kind of get that to a fairly neutral place. I like to reduce the highlights to bring out the detail in the sky. I like to increase the shadows a little bit just to see, you know, what we've got to work with in the shadows. And I like to increase the whites and increase the blacks. That gets the raw file to a really neutral place that you can then stylize further and add local contrast. That's going to be a big part of today's video, is how we deal with the image in parts rather than dealing with the image as a whole when we make these adjustments. So I also like to sometimes reduce the clarity. I think in images where there's, I guess, like a lot of sharp edges, there's lots of contrast, I like to reduce the effect of that a little bit. It just kind of softens the image. And I like to increase the vibrance. Let me just kind of quickly explain the difference between vibrance and saturation. So if you increase the saturation of your image using the saturation slider, you're going to increase every color pixel in the image. But if you increase the vibrance, what you're doing is you're actually just increasing the more muted colors. So the colors that are less saturated, you're only impacting those. So by increasing the vibrance, you're actually creating saturation in a much more balanced way. It's great for images that include people. So if you're doing portraits, anything where you want to, you know, maybe retain the saturation of the skin tones, but you want to maybe increase the saturation around that, that's where you would use vibrance, because it's just a little bit more focused, a bit more localized. So once we've got the image to this point, we can now start to move down to the curves. So my basic philosophy, which I mentioned in the last video, is I like soft highlights and contrasty shadows. And how I achieve that is by getting my tone curve here, creating 3 points, getting my shadow area, so everything in the darker parts of the image, I like to add that contrast. And then anything in the highlights, I like to just soften those. You can really notice it up here in the clouds. You'll notice if I drop that extreme highlight point, it just softens that. And I like to just soften or reduce this point here. You'll notice that when I actually increased the contrast in the shadows, do you notice how it actually adds saturation to the colors that are in that area as well? That's something that you have to be mindful of. And that's why I always like to do my tone curve adjustments before I deal with color, because contrast does impact color. It's something that some people forget, I think. So yeah, I'm at a pretty happy point now with the tone curve. And now let's talk about color. Color is a massive thing in photos. And for me personally, I use color, like I mentioned, to just add some subtle stylizing and just to shift the colors to a more pleasing place for me in terms of my preferences. So you can do that using the color curves, you can do that using the HSL panel, you can do that using color grading, or you can do that all the way down here using calibration. So let me talk you through, first of all, how I approach this. So I'm going to talk about calibration first because I'm not really going to use that in these images, but I'm going to explain when I would use them. Last year, I switched from Sony to Panasonic, and the differences that you find in camera bodies and in terms of the science, the color science within each camera will mean that your raw files and the images coming out of different cameras will look slightly different. I used to find the Sony had a much more sort of like green tint to the images, and the Panasonic has a more sort of like magenta-y tint to the images. So if I'm trying to match photos from my Panasonic to my Sony, then I'll use the calibration here and I can adjust the tints and I can adjust how these primary colors, red, green, and blue, I'm basically telling Lightroom where I want those colors to be categorized so that when I'm using the HSL sliders, that is impacting what Lightroom reads the colors as being, if that makes sense. So if I'm getting any kind of weird shift and if I'm not really liking how the greens look, or maybe, you know, how the blues look in the image, I might use the calibration tool to kind of get those to a point where they look more representative of what I want them to look like, I suppose. That way then when I'm making these adjustments with the sliders here, you know, adjusting the blues, adjusting the greens, I'm having control over what that color actually is, if that makes sense. Because sometimes you adjust, you know, the yellow and it might actually adjust the greens as well. So that's where calibration becomes useful. For me personally, I like to mainly lean on the color curves, HSL, and the color grading. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about color curves. I think color curves are really, really powerful. And they're a little bit intimidating, a little bit daunting if you've never used them before, but they give you far more, I guess, accuracy in terms of adding colors to certain parts of the image. So similarly to how the color grading works here, where you can add a color to the highlights, to the shadows, and to the midtones, what the color curves allow you to do is basically that, but you can be a lot more precise as to where you're actually injecting that color. So something I like to do, because I quite like a cinematic or like a filmic look to my images, I know it's a word that gets thrown around a lot and it's kind of lost all meaning by this point, and doing it via curves, for me, gives me that sort of precision. So here I'm looking at the red channel. So similarly to how we were doing the contrast curve earlier, you know, I'm going to add some points. Everything that's kind of up here is highlights, everything that's down here is shadows, and then you've got the midtones in the middle. And you can see here that by moving these points, you can create really, really big shifts in color. And I don't do any big shifts, I kind of keep everything fairly subtle. But what I like to do is just drop some cyan into the shadows, very, very subtly. What that does for me is it adds a little bit of cool tones into the shadows, which is quite, I guess, indicative of that sort of cinematic style. You can also then do the same. So if we went to the blue channel, for example, say you wanted to add some warmth into the highlights, then you can do that. You can notice that in the clouds up here. Ooh. If you just drop that point, you can just make the highlights a little bit warmer. That precision, I think, is something that's really powerful. And once I'm kind of at that point, I'll then move down to HSL. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at the individual colors in this photo, and I'm going to make some decisions about what I want to change. You don't have to change everything and you don't have to make big adjustments. But I like to start by looking at hue. So I move across here, I guess, from left to right. So firstly, I look at the image and I think, are any of the colors wrong in terms of the hue? And what I mean by hue is how that color is perceived. So let's take yellow, for example. Here, I would like to make the yellows a little bit more orange, just because we've got some orange tones here in the trailer, in the gate, and I want to just move the yellows slightly closer to orange and slightly further away from green. Because a lot of the yellow tones are mixed in with the green tones, I want to have some contrast and some separation there. So I'm going to change the hue. I'm not going to change the hue of any of the other colors because I think they look fairly natural, but I am going to change the saturation. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to desaturate the greens. You'll see it in this area here. Again, it's just adding a little bit more separation between the yellows and the greens. I'm going to increase the saturation of the orange. Again, it adds a bit more contrast. It gets the oranges further away from yellow, and it creates a little bit more of a focus on the trailer, which is sort of the subject of this particular image. And then with luminance, that's just how bright the colors are within this particular scene. So here, I'm probably going to reduce the luminance of the yellows. You can see if the luminance is too high, you start to actually lose saturation because it's just washing out the image. So for me, I want to retain the detail in the areas of yellow because it's all around the grasses. So just by reducing that luminance slightly, it retains that detail. I'm actually going to increase the luminance of the greens here, only because the greens are in shadow and I still want to have a little bit of detail there. So adding some luminance to the greens just helps with that. And I'll also increase the luminance of the orange just to make the oranges pop a little bit more. So this is an image that I shot last week in North Wales, and I really like the colours in this particular scene, but you'll notice that it's shot at completely different conditions than the last image, which was shot at golden hour. This was shot in the middle of the afternoon on a sunny day. So what I like to do here is, again, just be really mindful of contrast and really mindful of colour, because it's going to make a massive difference to this image. So let's first of all just get the image to a good point, a good flat blank canvas to work from. So treating this in the same way that I treated the previous image. You'll see just by adding that contrast brings in all that saturation. And especially where you've got very bright skies, which are, you know, quite indicative of midday, that's where really kind of like crushing the highlights, you can see the difference that makes. It just really helps subdue the image and remove some of that harshness. So here we've got some choices when it comes to color, and color is going to be a big thing with this particular image because I really don't like how sickly the kind of yellows and greens are of these grasses. So what we're going to do? Well, I'm going to treat these first of all just by looking at hue, saturation and luminance. I'm going to desaturate the greens. I'm going to move the hue of the yellow towards orange, and then I'm going to desaturate the yellow a little bit. I'm going to increase the saturation of the oranges, and I'm actually going to desaturate the blues here a little bit. You'll notice it in the distant mountains. I feel like that doesn't look particularly natural, especially because I remember what this looked like, you know, on the day. So because of that, I am just going to reduce that and make those mountains a bit more neutral. But then I'm going to add some more local color using color grading. So because this is kind of like a flat middle of the day, I don't want to be too precise necessarily, you know, with the color grading as opposed to how we did it with the curves. Here, I'm going to actually just add some blue tones into the shadows, because you're going to notice it more kind of around the underbelly of the boat. And because I want color contrast, if you think about the color wheel, blue is the opposite to orange. So because we've got so much orange around here, just adding this blue just really creates some nice harmony. And then I'm going to add some warmer tones into the highlights. I think that is pretty much it for that particular image. You know, I wouldn't really want to do more than that. It's just thinking about what you want to change rather than thinking that you have to change everything. So then if we look at those two images that I've edited, and if we look at them side by side, so we had this image here and this image here, you know, two different images, two completely different times of day, but they look quite similar next to each other. And that's something that I'm mindful of when it comes to my work, and really being conscious about contrast and how you treat your colors just really helps you create that cohesion. So, hope you found this video helpful. Let me know down in the comments below if there's anything that I didn't mention that you'd like to know more about. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'll be in the comments for the next couple of days answering all of those questions. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you did find it helpful, give the video a thumbs up. Subscribe if you've enjoyed this video and the previous videos that I've done. I'm having a pretty good spell on the channel at the moment. I've had some good interest in some recent videos, lots of new faces, lots of new subscribers, which I'm totally grateful for. It's a lot of effort putting all of these videos out, so it's always great when they get viewed by people and get well received. So super grateful for all of the support. Thank you for continuing to watch, and I will see you all next week for another one.